If you've ever heard of a gang boss in early 2000s in Brooklyn who dressed in drag, wigs, lipstick, heels to carry out hits, Raw Diggs likely comes to mind.
I was in the courtroom as this accused Bloods gang leader and rapper on the rise tried to counter the government's claims that he's a killer lord who terrorized his own community.
A feared Bloods leader and underground rapper from Brooklyn early took out Harlem's Jim Jones. His surreal methods blurred the line between myth and mayhem.
I just was always a wild, loose kid in my neighborhood. I just always went for mine. I maintained myself. I knew how to hustle, and I definitely wasn't no punk.
These little be running around like I wasn't brought up. I was brought up toting slammers. Like, so my belt had to be extra tight. You feel me?
So how did a street beef nearly become a murder headline? Here's how Jim Jones narrowly escaped one of NYC's deadliest figures. Ronald Herron, known across the boroughs as Raw Diggs, didn't start out as the menace that would later terrify half of Brooklyn. But if there was ever a place designed to forge a street legend, it was the Gowanus houses, one of the most violent and neglected housing projects in New York City. Located between Baltic Street and Hoyt Street in Brooklyn, the Gowanus projects in the late 1980s and 1990s were an ecosystem of their own, isolated from opportunity, plagued by crack-era violence, and policed only by the sound of gunfire and retaliation. Born in 1982, Raw came of age when the game was booming and bullets settled disputes faster than words. He wasn't the only kid in the Gowanus houses learning how to survive, but he was one of the few who seemed to absorb that chaos like it was second nature. By his early teens, Raw wasn't just reacting to the streets. He was shaping them. He robbed hustlers. He fought grown men. He watched and studied the codes of older gang members. And before long, he was formally initiated into the Bloods, quickly rising within a local set known as MMD, Murderous Mad Dogs. Raw stood out immediately. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and eerily quiet. People said he barely spoke unless he had to, and when he did, it was measured like someone who had already played out every scenario in his head before opening his mouth. His cold demeanor made people nervous. His loyalty to his set made him respected. But what really made Raw Diggs a ghost in Brooklyn street folklore was how he blended strategy with spectacle. He wasn't just ruthless, he was theatrical. And it was this dark performance art that made him unforgettable. One of the most chilling and bizarre tales associated with Raw Diggs unfolded around 2006 during the height of his ascent. The story, now infamous among gangland whispers, starts at a street party in Brownsville, another Brooklyn neighborhood known for bloodshed and block politics. According to multiple former affiliates and street informants, Raw ordered members of his own crew to dress in drag, complete with wigs, lipstick, and high heels in order to bypass security, approach rivals without raising suspicion, and get close enough to strike. But Raw didn't just sit back and give commands. He reportedly took part in the operation himself. He'd throw on a wig, heels, even carry a purse. One former associate later told federal investigators. He'd walk up real slow, like he was just one of the girls at the party, then boom, pull out the burner. For those who saw it, the shock didn't come from the weapon. It came from the reveal that the quiet, unassuming woman was actually Raw Diggs in disguise, ready to take a life without blinking. The tactic was more than just a gimmick. It reflected how Raw thought deception, misdirection, total psychological control. The goal wasn't just to eliminate his enemies. It was to haunt them before they even realized they were targets. Though no official convictions were tied directly to that specific incident, federal prosecutors included similar allegations during Raw's massive 2014 racketeering trial, stating that the use of disguise and surprise were consistent with his known behavior. To the courtroom, it was shocking. To the streets, it was old news. Raw's myth grew in every corner of Brooklyn. In Gowanus, Brownsville, Bed-Stuy, and parts of East New York, people whispered about him like he was a spirit that walked through walls. There were claims that he could vanish down stairwells before bullets landed, and that he often appeared on scenes just moments after someone had been shot. Calm, expressionless, and silent. Even his rap lyrics, published under the name Raw Diggs, fed into the legend. He rapped about bodies, betrayal, and blood, all with clinical precision. Some verses seemed to align with unsolved murders. Others mentioned real block names and coded threats that only locals could decipher. To the untrained ear, it sounded like hardcore rap. To those living on those blocks, it was a declaration of war or a confession. By the time the FBI began building their case, Raw Diggs had already become something more than a gang leader. He was folklore wrapped in fact, a shadow that moved through housing units with absolute power. His mix of brutal violence and theatrical tactics made him unforgettable. In a world where survival depended on myth, fear, and dominance, Raw Diggs turned the streets into a stage, and his role as Brooklyn's most feared ghost was fully realized. For those who doubted his story, the ending was usually the same. They disappeared. Or worse, they made the mistake of laughing at the idea that a man in lipstick and heels could be the last face they ever saw. And for most, that realization came too late.
I just was always a wild, loose kid in my neighborhood. I just always went for mine. I maintained myself. I knew how to hustle, and I definitely wasn't no punk. I'm from the era where we sold it, we didn't use them per se. That was the quote-unquote slogan.
Jim Jones isn't a stranger to street politics. Born in 1976 in the Bronx and raised in the Taft houses of Harlem, he grew up in what he once called the gutter within the gutter. By the late 1990s, he was already a visible figure in the Harlem rap scene, known for his affiliation with the Bloods and his role in the Diplomats, Dipset, alongside Cameron and Jules Santana. Jim carried himself with a certain code, respected by both rappers and street figures alike. But in 2009, during a seemingly ordinary recording session, Jim crossed paths with someone who didn't care about codes, Raw Diggs. At the time, Raw Diggs, born Ronald Herron, was attempting to transition from street legend to rap artist. Known in Brooklyn's Gowanus projects as a ruthless gang boss with a string of violent acts behind him, Raw was looking to flip his street rep into music credibility. That pursuit landed him in the same studio in Manhattan as Jim Jones. What should have been a collaborative opportunity turned deadly within minutes.
Raw Diggs got 3 life sentences. You heard about this?
I actually seen it on, I think it was on your website yesterday, and I was like, and I feel bad.
According to witnesses, the session took a sharp turn when Ross started talking openly about blood gang politics, something Jim Jones had a strict policy against discussing in studio spaces. Raw, who was used to being feared, stood frozen for a moment. He repeated himself, maybe to clarify or to check Jim's tone. But Jim didn't back down. Raw's temper flared. Within seconds, a glass door shattered, smashed by Raw Diggs as he stormed out of the studio. Later that same night, Jim Jones had a scheduled performance at Sue's Rendezvous, a popular strip club in Mount Vernon, New York. He showed up as planned, but didn't know Raw Diggs would be showing up too. When Raw entered the building with a group of goons behind him, the atmosphere shifted. The DJ stopped the music and announced Raw's arrival. That moment, according to one eyewitness, was when Jim turned pale. He looked like he saw a ghost, they said. Raw wasn't smiling, and neither were the men flanking him. Jim Jones didn't finish his set. He reportedly slipped out the back before the second song ended, surrounded by a few of his own people. But what the public didn't see that night was what nearly happened behind the scenes. According to sources close to the event, one of Raw Diggs' armed crew members was posted near the exit, watching Raw for a single look. If Raw had nodded or raised his hand, the plan was to strike. There would have been no argument, no second chance. That single gesture would have turned Jim into another name on Raw Diggs' growing list of enemies who never made it home. But the signal never came. For reasons still debated on the streets, Raw let him walk. Some say Raw knew that murdering a high-profile rapper like Jim Jones would bring federal heat and spark a media storm that could interfere with his own rap ambitions. Others believe Jim had protection, maybe someone in his circle who was powerful enough to make Raw pause. It wasn't respect, it wasn't fear, it was a strategy. That moment marked a strange kind of mercy from a man who rarely showed any. Jim Jones didn't just dodge beef, he dodged a bullet. Raw Diggs' criminal resume read like a horror script, but it was all too real. He ran more than just a gang in Brooklyn. He ran a violent street empire headquartered at 423 Baltic Street, deep in the heart of the Gowanus houses. His crew, known as the Murderous Mad Dogs, operated like a paramilitary unit. They were involved in extortion, armed robbery, witness intimidation, and multiple homicides. The building he operated out of wasn't just a home, it was a fortress, and his name alone could silence a courtroom before he even walked in. One of the earliest examples was in 2001, Raw Diggs found himself facing a MDR charge for the K-ing of Frederick Brooks, an alleged rival dealer. On June 16, 2001, Brooks was gunned down in the lobby of 198 Bond Street, shot multiple times in the face, neck, back, and head. The incident occurred in the lobby of a Brooklyn apartment building around 2007. Dio was cornered, pistol whipped, and stripped of nearly $700 in cash. Later, Raw confronted him and casually said it was nothing personal. On a separate occasion, when Raw spotted Doe walking with his young child, he chose not to harm him, but Raw was never sentimental. A few months later, he gave Doe permission to return to dealing drugs on one condition: he had to buy his product directly from Raw. That was how Raw operated. Control was more important than violence, and when violence came, it was calculated. Others didn't receive that same mercy. In 2008, a man named Richard Russo reportedly made a disrespectful comment about Raw Diggs. Raw said nothing at the time. He didn't threaten, argue, or confront Russo publicly. Instead, he waited. Then, during a quiet encounter inside an apartment elevator, Raw pulled out a weapon and executed Russo in cold blood. He handed off cash to his trusted enforcers to dispose of the firearm and ensure no one spoke. No fingerprints, no witnesses, just silence, and another name off his list. Then there was the situation with Kendall Robinson, also known on the streets as Smurf. Raw had once worked alongside Robinson, but by 2009, tensions had grown. Robinson was attracting too much attention from law enforcement in the Gowanus projects, and Raw saw him as a liability. One afternoon, Robinson was shot in broad daylight in front of 185 Nevin Street. He survived the attack, but the message was clear. This wasn't random, it was Raw asserting dominance. Ironically, Kendall Robinson would later end up in headlines himself. He was eventually convicted and sentenced for executing a teenage girl, one of the most shocking and tragic crimes to ever shake the neighborhood. While his story unraveled in the courts, Raw Diggs' name remained tied to every corner of that project. Raw's rule was built on fear, but it was sustained by strategy. He didn't act out of impulse. He planned every move, removed every threat, and never hesitated to take someone out if they disrupted his control. From calculated mercy to cold-blooded murder, Raw Diggs turned Brooklyn streets into a war zone and himself into the most feared name in the borough. Raw Diggs wasn't just feared on the streets of Brooklyn, he was also talented behind the mic. He rapped with a rawness that blurred the line between art and confession. In 2010, he appeared on Waka Flocka Flame's track Live by the Gun, alongside fellow New York rapper Uncle Murda. The collaboration gave Raw a broader platform, but what shocked listeners later was how real the lyrics were. He didn't just tell stories, he described actual crimes.
I brought up toting slammers. Like, so my belt had to be extra tight. You feel me?
In one verse, Raw mentioned how he was shot in the leg. Then he calmly stated that the man who shot him was found dead just 2 days later. Law enforcement later confirmed that the timeline matched an unsolved murder connected to Raw's crew. In the same track, he spoke openly about murderous mad dogs, MMD, his blood set based out of Gowanus, Brooklyn. He didn't mask names or locations. He boasted about dropping bodies to earn respect, and many of those references aligned with homicides that the FBI would later link to him in court. In another song titled Slow Down, Raw rapped, "If he was smart, he would have shot me in the head, 'cause I can get you shot from a hospital bed." At the time, fans saw it as street bravado, but after his arrest and trial, those lyrics were viewed in a far more chilling light. Prosecutors used multiple songs as evidence during his 2014 federal racketeering case, arguing that his music was not fictional, it was autobiographical. What made his music more damning was where it was filmed. His music videos were often shot in and around 423 Baltic Street, the same place he used as his criminal headquarters. With guns flashing on screen and known gang affiliates appearing in scenes, Raw made no effort to hide his world. To outsiders, it looked like another hardcore rapper pushing shock value, but to the FBI, it was a visual map of his network. By the time Raw Diggs stood trial, his songs had become exhibits. His lyrics weren't metaphors, they were declarations. Every beat carried a warning, and every verse left a trail of real blood behind it. Despite his street intelligence and reputation for calculated moves, Raw Diggs made critical mistakes that allowed law enforcement to finally catch up. In 2010, after years of building a case, federal agents moved in. On October 5th, members of the NYPD and U.S. Marshals arrested him outside Club Amnesia, a nightclub in Manhattan, just as he was beginning to gain visibility in the rap world. The arrest was swift, but Raw's fate had already been sealed by the evidence investigators had spent years collecting.
Go and beat the body with an 18 beat. If you ain't never beat a body, then you ain't like me.
They allege that Heron is guilty of racketeering charges for running a dealing operation in the Gowanus housing development where he grew up. They also claim he was involved in 3 murders and 3 attempted murders.
By 2012, the full weight of the federal government was on him. He was indicted on 23 counts, including 3 murders, racketeering, attempted murder, weapons possession, and witness intimidation. Prosecutors didn't just rely on street testimony. They brought in former friends and gang associates who had flipped, turning state's witnesses to avoid their own time behind bars. Raw's own lyrics were played in court as part of the prosecution's argument that his music wasn't entertainment. It was a confession. The trial exposed the violent empire Raw had built in the Gowanus projects and beyond. It showed how he used fear, manipulation, and murder to control his crew and silence enemies. Witnesses recounted hits carried out under his orders, moved through his command, and guns stashed in apartments throughout Brooklyn. His music videos, lyrics, and even phone calls were used as evidence, painting a complete picture of a man who lived every word he rapped. On June 26, 2014, the verdict was announced in a federal courtroom. Raw Diggs was found guilty on all counts. The sentence was unprecedented. He received 3 life sentences plus an additional 105 years. The judge acknowledged Raw's intelligence and called him articulate, but noted his complete lack of remorse. As Raw stood before the court, he stared directly at the judge and said, "You can sentence me to 10 life sentences. I'm only going to die once." But the court gave him even more than he predicted. Raw Diggs was ultimately sentenced to 12 life terms and transferred to ADX Florence, a federal supermax prison located in Colorado. Known as the most secure prison facility in the United States, ADX Florence houses the country's most dangerous inmates. Raw now shares a compound that once held El Chapo, the late Ted Kaczynski, and Ramzi Youssef, the 1993 World Trade Center bomber. Raw Diggs, who once ran Brooklyn like a war general and moved through the streets like a phantom, now spends 23 hours a day in solitary confinement. For a man who built his power through visibility, the silence of ADX is the harshest sentence of all. Raw Diggs used whatever it took to maintain power in the streets of Brooklyn. Fear, deception, brutality. He wielded them all with precision. And for a brief moment in 2009, Harlem rapper Jim Jones came dangerously close to becoming another name on his long list of enemies. Their tense encounter, sparked during a recording session and nearly ending in bloodshed at Sue's Rendezvous in Mount Vernon, could have turned fatal. That Jim Jones walked away untouched is viewed by many as a miracle, not strategy. Some who knew Ronald Heron, Raw's real name, insist he followed a certain code. They believe he made calculated decisions, striking only when the consequences aligned with his goals. Others say Jim Jones simply got lucky, possibly protected by unseen hands or spared because of the attention a high-profile murder would have brought. Either way, the tension between those 2 men was real. The danger was seconds away from becoming deadly. What Raw Diggs' story shows is that when street fame collides with unchecked violence, the outcome isn't just aggressive lyrics or gritty videos. It becomes chaos in real life. And in the world Raw built, where myth, fear, and bloodshed walked side by side, the line between legend and lunacy was razor thin.